We are so grateful to the generosity of our speakers and how they've captured this vision, and the generosity of their time and effort and energies and talents is just remarkable. And today we're privileged to have Tom Thibodeau's boss with us. He told me to say that. Dr. Rick Kyte, the head of the Reinhart Institute on Business and Ethics, is here with us, comes highly recommended, and we're deeply appreciative of giving him a warm welcome. Rick Kyte.
Well, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be here. I had no idea that this group was so big. When I first talked to Terry, I don't know, a few months ago, it wasn't this big a group. That's why you don't have that many handouts. I was able to put one or two on each table. But it's great to be here. I teach at a university founded by nuns where the biggest program is nursing, and it's unusual to have so much testosterone in one room. I've been teaching ethics for over 20 years, and a lot of people ask me, why did you go into ethics? What made you decide that? And I'm not sure, because I didn't like taking classes in ethics when I was an undergraduate. It's just that as I started studying things, I went on in school and started thinking, I thought, I want to do something that's really useful, and that's useful for me personally, as being a father and just being a community member. And as I started studying more of ethics academically, I thought there's a real need here because I don't like the way it's taught. I don't like this talk of abstract theories that seem to have no connection to what we're doing. As I was going through graduate school, my wife and I were running a miniature golf course in Colorado. I was going to grad school in Baltimore. Every summer we drive back to Colorado, run a miniature golf course. And when you're running a business, even if it's a real small business, you're confronted with ethical issues on a daily basis. How do you advertise while being truthful and honest about what you're advertising? How do you deal with conflicts with customers when they think you said one thing and you think you said another? How do you deal with an employee who's incompetent, who's a really nice person, but just can't do what you ask them to do? Okay? What if you develop trust issues? What if you have conflict among employees? You know, it's all these. I had a real hard time understanding how anything I was studying about ethics helped me to figure out what to do. When I tried to figure out what to do, I would always go back to significant people in my life, and I'd think through, now, how do they handle that kind of issue? Now, what's really significant is whenever I would try to do that, the people that I would really trust about how to handle something, especially in conflict with other people, would be Christians, right? Because they wouldn't automatically fall to just a kind of a defensiveness or anger or self-interest. There'd be a genuine try. How do I enact the commandment to love my neighbor, right? How do I enact the golden rule? There's real concerns. Now, when I started thinking about how does that fit in what I'm studying about ethics, well, it did in a way, but I had to go way back to the same kind of context in which out of which the Old Testament and New Testament arise. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the idea of the virtues and the vices, these traditional moral concepts that are first articulated by the Greeks, but we find them in every culture. And it's out of this context that Paul is writing. And when he's writing about virtues of faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love, right? He's writing out of a context and also in response to Greek and Roman conceptions of the virtues, which he assumes is understood by everybody there. But at the time that I was studying ethics academically, that was all pretty much ignored, right? It was all about how do we apply certain abstract principles to situations. And I just think it's bogus. Okay? And it took me a long time of teaching ethics to figure out how to teach it better. And I've been working on that project for a number of years now. Just published a book this summer that's a result of that work, trying to give my best experience. How do we teach ethics? How do we understand it? And one of the handouts at your table has a little self-promoting flyer on one side, but the other side is a kind of one-sheet basic summary of this. Whenever we try to make any decision about what's right or wrong, good or bad, we're using one of four kinds of thinking. Now these aren't theories. It isn't because we've read Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill or something like that. It's just what we're brought up with. And what we find is people all over the world will use these ways of thinking. It's just that some cultures will prefer one way or another way more than others. But all over the world you find these four ways of thinking. And the first one is just truth. Like, what is really going on? What's the context? Okay? Are there any laws? If you're in a company, what are our company policies or rules? If you're in a profession, what is your professional code of conduct? Just the background information, but basically what's going on. Secondly is consequences. Of the various options we have for acting in a situation, who's affected by those possible actions and how? And then comparing those possible actions, which one provides the best consequences for people and which would provide the worst consequences. That's a way of deciding what should we do. So when you say things like, well, what's the bottom line? You're looking at consequences, right? Okay? Or if you do like a cost-benefit analysis, that's looking at consequences. That's a natural way we have of thinking. Third way of thinking is in terms of fairness. How would I feel if somebody did that to me? You're putting yourself in the other person's position. This is just the golden rule, right? And we find the golden rule expressed in every single culture in the world has some version of the golden rule. Okay? In fact, what age were you when you first learned how to think in terms of the golden rule? 3. Right. Yeah. What age do you tell your kids? How would you feel if Mary did that to you? I mean, you say that to your kid. Okay? And consequence, the same thing. Did you really think what would happen if you did that? Do you think ahead about this at all, right? Is that true? I mean, truth and fairness and consequences. We start teaching this to our kids. We were taught it as kids. Okay? So by the time we're the age we are now, right? We've been using this kind of thinking, all these ways of thinking, on a daily basis for years and years and years. We're really good at it. And the final way of thinking is character. These are just, instead of thinking about just the action, you think about the character traits, right, that inform the action. So is somebody being rude or generous or kind or courageous or cowardly, right? This is where we evaluate the person. Now that's a different way of thinking about something than if you say, is that the right thing to do? You're saying, well, is that a good way of acting? These are just different ways of thinking about something, but you can approach almost any problem from any one of these 4 directions. Most of the ethical conflicts that we get into, when we have a disagreement with somebody, they're caused because we're using different ways of thinking without knowing it. So we're so good. We've learned these ways of thinking so well. We've been doing it on a daily basis since we were about 3 years old, that it's as natural to us as breathing. So when you get into a disagreement with somebody, what you automatically do is you start thinking subconsciously. You aren't thinking about this consciously, just subconsciously. What works best for the conclusion I want to reach? And if thinking about consequences works best for your conclusion, that's what you're going to use. If the other person's fairness is working best, that's what they're going to use. And pretty soon you're talking like this. Because if I'm arguing with you about the consequences of something, and you're coming back about how it wouldn't be fair, what I'm thinking is, you're not even paying attention to what I'm saying, right? Because you're not responding to what I'm saying about the bad consequences of that decision. And if you're telling me about fairness, and I'm not responding to that, you're thinking, I either don't understand what you're saying, or I don't care, I'm unethical, right? Because I'm not recognizing what's really important is the issue of fairness. And sometimes this divides families, it divides co-workers, sometimes it divides whole communities. A few years ago, Matthew Construction wanted to build a new asphalt plant just north of La Crosse in Bryce Prairie. Any of you here connected with Matthew in any way or done any business with Matthew? Do you remember this conflict? It was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it really divided the community. The La Crosse Tribune, there were letters to the editor every day in the paper for over a year. And there were 2 Sundays where they devoted a whole page just to letters on that topic. I don't recall anything that's been so divisive in our community in the 12 years that I've lived there. And, well, I just started, I'm an ethics teacher. I'm interested in how do people actually talk about these disagreements. I cut them out. I cut them out and I categorized them. Just about everybody opposed this new asphalt plant being located in Bryce Prairie, just across the street from Lakeside Homes on Lake Onalaska. Just about everybody opposed to it were opposed because they had some interest. They lived along there. Well, if you live along there, you don't want an asphalt plant located across the street from your house overlooking the lake, right? That's natural. But you convince anybody to oppose this by saying, oppose this because I don't want it in my backyard. That doesn't work. So you think of some other arguments. So they came up with all kinds of things, like the threat of runoff, pollution into the lake, air pollution, increased truck traffic on the roads, and we have lots of kids that are riding their bikes and they could have accidents. You came up with all kinds. Now what kind of thinking is this? Consequences. And almost all the letters to the editor that were opposed to the plant going into that property on Bryce Prairie were opposed to it because of the consequences. Now the people that were in favor of the plant, some employees, friends or family members of employees of Matthew or people that did business with Matthew Construction, they of course want the plant to go up because they want to keep the jobs there. They want to make sure that business stays local. But they don't just say that, they say other things like, look, this property was zoned for industrial use. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game. If the property owners around there wanted that to be zoned for residential use only, they have 30 years to change the law. What kind of argument is this? It's truth. It is, they're pointing to it. That's how it was zoned. But the fairness is you can't change the rules in the middle of the game. You wouldn't want people changing rules affecting you. Okay, right? This is a matter of fairness. This is the procedure. This is the process that we agree to. Okay? The other kind of argument that was given often is Matthew's a great employer. They're a philanthropic company. It's the kind of people that we want in our community. What kind of argument is that? Character. Right? So you have character and fairness, and you have consequences. And as the year went on, you had 2 groups of people that got more and more upset with each other. Because both were using ethical reasoning. Right? It wasn't that one side was being rational and the other side was being irrational. And it wasn't that one side was completely self-interested and the other was not. They were both self-interested because we're generally we both always have an interest in these things. That's why we participate in the discussion. Right? But they're upset because neither side was addressing the concerns of in the same way. And when that happens, you can't help but feeling the person you're talking to, if they're not responding to the same kind of thinking that you are, you can't help but thinking they're too dumb to understand what I'm saying or they just don't care. And if the person you're talking to either doesn't care or is really stupid, what do? You can either ignore them or you can yell at them. But there's not much point talking to them anymore. Right? Now, I think the majority of the conflicts that we get into with one another are caused by these different ways of thinking. We're so good at choosing ways of thinking to fit our topic and situation that we don't know we're doing that and we talk right past each other. Now, I've been teaching ethics for a long time, right? And what I just told you, this is just a very quick summary of what I usually take a few weeks to explore, look at evidence for, and look at examples of things in a class. But I've been teaching this stuff for a long time. A couple of years ago, I come home, and I walk in. My son, at the time, he's 14 years old, and it's a Thursday afternoon. It was 5:30. I'm walking the door, and they're in an argument over whether you can have a sleepover at a friend's house that night. School night. He's saying, yeah, my friend's parents all said it was okay, and we're gonna all study together. She said, but you've got a test tomorrow. Oh, we're all in the same class. We're gonna study for that test. You're not gonna study for that. You're gonna stay up. You're gonna be watching basketball or something. You're gonna stay up, and you won't get any sleep. Oh, we're all gonna go to bed early. That's not gonna happen. So I'm teaching ethics. I'm teaching this four-way method for decision making. So what do? Walk in the room. Say to my son, yeah, are you nuts? You're not going to get any sleep. You're always grumpy the next day when you have a sleepover. You get sleep over Friday night, but not Thursday. Right? We fall into this so quickly that even after teaching this stuff all day, I come home and I just jump right in without thinking about what I'm doing. I just jump right into the argument. Now the next day I realized what had happened. You know, lots of times hindsight's 20/20. You think back, well, this is what I'm trying to teach all the time, right? Talk past each other. And so I said to my wife, this is Friday night. I said, you know, whatever happened with that sleepover deal? Did you find out what was going on? She said, yeah, I talked to the other parents. They all had the same argument at their house. None of the parents said that their kids could have a sleepover, right? We all jumped right past truth. I never even asked. You know, we didn't have to have the argument. Now here's the thing. You're not going to get over self-interest. You're not going to make everybody agree by recognizing what kind of reasoning different people are using. What you're going to do is be able to recognize that we're all rational people here. We're all people trying to figure out what to do. We have different ways of talking about and so forth. So when we do have disagreements, we at least know why. We don't get angry. We don't give up on talking with each other. Because, you know, we have to settle disputes, whether it's at home or in the workplace or in the community, and then you have to go on living with people, right? And you don't want to get in a situation where you say things you regret. It makes it really hard to get along and work again in the future. Okay? So you want to have a decent understanding. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about here was the idea of the virtues. And the virtues are character traits. And of these four ways of thinking, it's the virtues that we have the most difficulty talking about. People in traditional societies have a much easier time talking about the virtues because there's a greater emphasis on that. In the United States right now, 21st century, I would say this has been the case for most of maybe the last 100 years in the United States. Our preferred way of thinking is consequences. We're very practical-minded people. We want to know what the result will be. And so most of our political debates, they start out, first of all, talking about consequences. Then they might bring in some other things too. But that's what we move to first. And we know that language really well. We're really good at it. We're pretty good at fairness, because fairness is mostly about process. What are the rules we agree to for doing something? Okay? When we're talking about whether it's fairness or equality, respect, these sorts of things, that's fairness. Okay? The character we have a harder time with. And that makes it problematic if we're trying to live a life that's informed by Scripture, because it's primarily Scripture thinking that you find both the Old and the New Testaments. Okay? When Jesus is telling parables, he's not simply trying to point out this is the way to act in this kind of situation. He's trying to help us develop a different way of thinking about a situation. Okay? So our perception of the problem changes, not just of the answer to the problem, but the perception of the problem. And this is what character traits do. Okay? Now, furthermore, it's primarily character traits that we pass down to our children. So this is why it's so important. If we want to be good husbands and fathers and grandparents, we have to pay more attention to character traits than anything else. The other stuff they're going to pick up, and you can pick up by just talking. But character traits you pick up by interaction, by behaviors. Because it works in this way. You do something, you act a certain way. Over a time, it's repeated. It becomes a habit. That habit then becomes second nature. It becomes part of who you are. Okay? And then it affects your very perception of the way things are. Okay? So, in influencing our children's character, we are really influencing who they are, what kind of person they, and then in some ways what kind of world they inhabit. And I grew up in Frazee, Minnesota, home of the world's largest turkey. You probably all heard of it. It's on Highway 10, about 60 miles east of Fargo. And in a town of 1,000 people. My dad was a house cleaner. My mother was a nurse. And one grandpa was a turkey farmer. The other one was a contractor, and then he was a horse trader for a while, and then he cheated too many people and became a real estate agent. And my extended family was, I noticed I had a really odd relationship with the men in my extended family because we'd have great relationships in the summer and fall as long as there was fishing and hunting. I did a lot of things with the men. Winter and spring, it was awful because there was nothing to do. And I remember as a kid going to family events. If you're in a community with a big extended family, you know, you get together for every birthday and holidays and everything. You get together a lot. Any of you still in areas where you have a lot of extended family around? And you get together for things. I would notice that the women tend to be in one room, the men in another. And men had two topics: Minnesota Vikings and hunting. You go into the and yeah, that's a problem. It can be pretty depressing. When you're a child, you wander around the house. You know, you aren't really confined to just one room and the other. And the women were always talking about something different. And they didn't care if they didn't know what they were talking about. They'd talk about it anyway. Even when I was 10 years old, yeah, I know. I wouldn't share this with them. But it's being recorded. Yeah. But there was something deeper, and I think it's something that has affected men. And I certainly see it in my classrooms too. Like young women have a much greater willingness to speak up and talk about difficult subjects and be vulnerable publicly. Whereas men want to know what they're talking about before they talk about it. And you can't learn about something if you won't talk about it until you know about it. Right? That's a real problem. And then I started looking at what's going on with, because my dad would withdraw from discussion. When he'd have a conflict, he'd just withdraw. This is terrible for relationships, right? If you can't talk through problems. Because marriage is a conversation. It's extended conversation that you just have to keep renewing day after day. Because conversation literally means to turn together. In a marriage, there's all kinds of things pulling you apart, and you have to continually pull together. And if you have one person who just turns away, right, that's a bad marriage. Children know that. His dad, my grandpa Emmett, his response to conflict was to get really angry. You know, as you get older, you start thinking back, what was going on in my family? Well, my grandpa would get angry. So my dad, the oldest son in the family, his response was to turn away, to avoid it. Because you have two responses in that situation. You either become angry yourself, right, or you turn away. There's got to be a way of handling conflict without avoiding it and without making it worse. Now, I got to share you one story about my grandfather. His response was to get angry. Fortunately, because I was a grandson, the anger was never directed at me, right? Now, I felt the effects of it because it did affect my dad, right, and other family members. Never directed. So he used to take me to Monday that pro wrestling. It was the first Monday night of every month at the Fargo Coliseum, and he had a group of 4 buddies, and they had 5 permanently reserved seats, front row, Fargo Coliseum for pro wrestling on Monday nights. And once in a while, when one of the guys couldn't go, he'd call me up and pick me up at the house, and off we'd go. And so one day, I'm about 10, 11 years old, and he picks me up. It was February. Get in the car in this station wagon. My grandpa's, and he's got his Stetson on in the car, and he's smoking a cigarette. And Dan Waters next to him, he's smoking a cigar. And Carl Peterson's smoking a pipe. Gus Reeby, he's got a cigarette, and I'm sitting in the back. We get to Detroit Lakes, 10 miles down the road. I can't even breathe in this car. The windows are off, and it's so smoky inside. They can't see out the windows. My grandpa's got the windshield wipers on, said, it's so foggy. I don't know why it got so foggy. So we get to Fargo, we see this pro wrestling match, and there's always Dan Scrap Irons Pajensky. He's in the first match. He was also a referee later on. My grandpa never thought it was the same person. I thought, no, the referee looks like Dan Scrap Irons Pajensky. Oh yeah, they just look a lot alike, but that's something different. The last match of the evening is a tag team match. And it's Dirty Dusty Rhodes and Larry Pretty Boy Henning. Remember Larry Pretty Boy Henning?
Oh yeah.
So, yep. So these are the bad guys, and I can't remember who the good guys were. So you didn't know who was supposed to win, right? And so they're wrestling as a tag team match, and at one point, Dirty Dusty Rhodes is in the middle of the mat. He's got one of the good guys down on the mat, and he's almost got him pinned, and the referee is down, and he's down on the floor, and he's giving him the 10 count, and he'll get to about 5, and the guy will lift the shoulder, and he has to start over. And Larry Pretty Boy Henning comes around the outside of the ring, and he gets right in front of us. So he sneaks up on the good guys who's up on the outside of the ropes, sneaks up behind him, puts him in the chokehold, right? And starts pounding on his head. And the referee's got his back turned. My grandpa was really upset. Everybody shouted. But he hated that guy. I mean, my grandpa had pro wrestling magazines in his real estate office. I mean, it inspired a lot of confidence in his customers. But this was his recreation. He believed every word in these magazines. And he couldn't believe the cheating that was going on and the indignation. And a whole life worth of indignation comes out. And he's up and he's shouting, and everybody in the Coliseum is shouting. The referee is pretending not to hear it. So he reaches over to Dan Waters, this nice little guy. He's got a cane. He's sitting there with a cane, and he reaches right across me. He grabs his cane, and he goes up to Larry Pretty Boy Henning, and he whacks him on the head. And Henning turns around and grabs the cane, and he throws my grandpa. My grandpa just runs down. And he sits on his seat. Larry Pretty Boy Henning's got the cane, he's choking this guy with the cane, and the whole Coliseum is standing up and they're shouting, and the referee said, something just happened. And finally turns around, they call security guards, they get the cane away, they get order reestablished in the ring, they've got 2 security guards, and the referee are walking around the outside ring saying, whose cane is this? And Dan Waters is sitting there. Dan Waters, meekest, nicest guy you'd ever want to meet. He's sitting there and he just raises his hand like he's in first grade. His hand. They pick him up under each arm and escort him out the Coliseum. My grandpa just sits there like So I decided right there I'm going into ethics. See, character traits, we pass them down by our behaviors, by our actions. And it's not the behaviors, it's not necessarily the character traits we intend to pass down, right? It's just who we have become, who we are. That's what we pass down. And then our children, well, stop them sometimes if they want to kind of emulate us, but sometimes they just react to it, right? And develop other character traits based on these reactions. Now, there's a tradition in the ancient Greek world of thinking about the 4 cardinal virtues. And these are called cardinal virtues. The Latin word cardinal comes from cardes, or hinge. You can think of them as the pivotal virtues. Everything hangs upon these 4 virtues, right? Pivotal ones. And they correspond to what the Greeks thought of as the parts of the person. Your mind, your body, and your spirit. So the first virtue is wisdom. That is knowing what's really true. Knowing the way the world is, not thinking it's the way you want it to be. Right? Knowing the way the world really is. That's wisdom. Having an understanding. Sometimes we just call this common sense. Right? We know that people who really understand what's going on, people that we go to for advice and so forth. This is wisdom. It's not the same as cleverness. Right? It's not what you measure in an IQ test or an ACT or something like that. In fact, there's very, very little correlation between ACT college entrance exams and success in life. Almost none. Right? There's a lot of correlation between wisdom and success in life. Because if you know what's really going on, you're going to do fairly well. Right? Wisdom, virtue of the mind. Virtue of spirit is courage. As a virtue of spirit, because you think of the spirited part of ourselves, the part that gets either afraid or angry. And the virtues, by the way, don't have one opposite. They have 2. They have an excess and a deficiency. An excess in the spirited part. Courage is the proper functioning of the spirited part, the proper functioning of your emotional life, right? But an excess is anger or rashness, rushing in where you shouldn't because you've let emotions get out of control. We have an expression for it, flying off the handle. Take it from logging days, or an axe head would come off the handle. Or when you're chopping wood, what happens when the axe head comes off? Nothing good. And is there any control? Sometimes people get hurt, sometimes they don't. It all depends who happens to be in the way. And anger functions like that. Once you get angry, you're not really using good judgment anymore. So once you get angry, wisdom, the virtue of the mind, disappears. And the spirited part takes over and wants to rule. Right? That was my grandpa. When he would get angry, just forget everything else. He saw the object of his anger. That was it. So the spirited part rules. The virtue of the body is temperance. And this is proper control of your desires. Now, when's the last time you used the word temperance in a discussion? No? Yesterday. Isn't it amazing? We use the word courage quite a bit in our society. So we understand the need for that. We've lost the word temperance. And it's interesting, when you lose a word in a society, you lose the concept as well. Right? We do not have a habit of talking about what is the proper way to desire things. We talk a lot about dieting, right? But we don't talk about, say, what is the proper way to enjoy food? We talk about eating too much or trying not to eat at all. Right? Temperance is all about not enjoying things too much or too little, but taking the right kind of appreciation in our bodies, in our physical existence. I think it's very interesting that this is a concept that we completely have kind of forgotten as a virtue. Now here's what the Greeks had said about this. You need wisdom, courage, and temperance. You need these three. And if you have those three virtues, right, then you get the fourth, which is justice. And justice is right in between. Justice, which is also, we talk about being right relationships. Justice is where you have the proper relationships with your neighbors, with other people. Okay? That comes about when you have these other good character traits. Now, I find this really useful, a really interesting way to think about our lives. That it's not just a matter of doing the right thing in this or that situation. It's trying to always act out of wisdom, having to understand what's really going on, what's really relevant or important here. Courage. I don't act out of fear or anger, but have a kind of a proper emotional response. That is, when somebody does something really bad, I'm properly indignant, right? And I might get angry, but I also don't let anger supplant my judgment. The proper time and place for anger, and then there's a proper amount for it too. And then physical desire, so that I take pleasure in doing things. I enjoy a good meal, right, with friends, cup of coffee. I enjoy beer. I don't enjoy getting drunk, but I enjoy beer, right? Now there's a difference here. This is something I think we do a terrible job talking to our kids about, right? We'll talk a lot about, what should the age limit be for alcohol. One of the biggest problems we have with our students right now is on the 21st birthday, it's regarded as almost obligatory to go out and get completely smashed. That's a sick culture that thinks you're supposed to be abstinent until 21 and then get completely drunk out of your mind. Right? We need to have a vocabulary so we even talk about this stuff with our kids. So this is how we, right, try to live our lives. Now, the great contribution of Christian culture to this is the Greeks. That was the virtues, and what you get it first in Paul, and then you get a later development of this in a lot of Christian writings, starting with St. Augustine, and then later with Aquinas, and then in the Reformation with Calvin and Knox and Luther. You get the theological virtues. And I have a handout there that shows these cardinal virtues on one side, the theological virtues. Theological virtues are faith, hope, and love. And what they recognize, and Augustine in particular, is that the other virtues are really important, and they correspond to the kind of proper functioning of the person. But they don't do enough to really establish our character trait in relationships to others. And it's love that does that primarily. And the reason love is the greatest of the three, of faith, hope, and love, is you can't have love without faith and hope. Right? You have to have faith, you have to have trust. Right? And whether this is love of God or love of neighbor, right? You have to have trust in order to establish a relationship on an ongoing basis to be a relationship of love. And you also have to have hope, because despair is the opposite of hope. Despair destroys our willingness to continue to engage with others. Despair and cynicism, right? That's giving up. So these three go together, faith, hope, and love. Right? And this is really a Christian contribution to the world, is the emphasis on those virtues primarily, in addition to the cardinal ones. Now, I find this very valuable, and I find it valuable just to look at what are the occasions I can find for talking about it, because when I talk about these, then people hold me accountable to them. Right? And I primarily have to be held accountable for them so that I model them for my children. Because it's not enough to just talk about the virtues to my children. What I mainly have to do is show how they're enacted. When I get in a situation that could make me really angry, how do I handle it? Right? That's what they're watching. Okay. Now here's the other thing that we have certain virtues. Everybody has certain character traits, certain virtues that we acquire. And we acquire them from our families, usually. And then we have vices that we've acquired. You know, character traits that haven't been fully developed, or bad character traits developed. And how do we correct them? What do we do? It's primarily through association with people who have the virtues. We put ourselves in the company of the people that have the virtues that we would like to work on. Because it's in that daily interaction, it's in seeing it, okay, that we change our behavior. Because there's no way of just saying, okay, I'm going to be more courageous, more generous, more wise tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. It works in very small increments, right, through association with people that we respect and admire. And that's the only way it works, and then it can work at any age. So, I think I've come to 1 o'clock. Is that right? Is the timekeeper here? So, thank you very much for your time.